So I'll just introduce quickly the background of Federico Alvarez Igarzábal, and he studied from 2003 on in Cordoba, Argentina. He's native Argentinian, but now also German, and he studied visual art and technology in Cordoba, audiovisual communication, and also theoretical medial arts. At the same time, so studying this more on a theoretical point of view, but you already see quite a different aspects. He also was an artist, yeah? So I remember him talking to or telling me about one of his objects of art where he tried to mimic our perception of time, of present moment, future perspective, and past perspective. I was quite impressed and actually encouraged him to redesign this object of art because I think it was a really fantastic idea. So Federico, we have a person who started from the humanities, from all these subjects I just talked to, also practically an artist working on time. And then he came to Germany and studied in Cologne, at the Technical University of Cologne, and did his PhD there on his thesis. And he presented a little bit at the beginning, which became a book on time and space in video games. I got to know Federico at exactly this time because he approached me because he was really trying to incorporate the psychological and the neuroscience concepts of time perception into these theories of video gaming and the theoretical conceptions underlying video gaming. And then I was basically his co-advisor of his thesis, and also was present at his defense in Cologne. Then 2016, until he arrived at our lab in 2019, he was a research assistant at the Cologne Game Lab, where they really study producing video games. And at the same time also, he has had several lecture positions at Ruhr-Universität Bochum, the Filmhochschule Köln, and also the Institute for Media, Culture and Theatre in Cologne. So he really had a lot of different also lecture experiences. Now he came to us in 2019, beginning of 2019, related to our EU project, Virtual Times, where Federico will talk a little bit about, and where we have also connection with 6 different labs spread over Europe. And one is, people know her, Anne Girsch in Strasbourg and Kai Vogelei in Cologne. So psychiatrists working on psychiatric patients and with which we collaborate. And so just last few sentences about why also the VR technology, I think, for our institute is actually of excellence. And we have another tool to work experimentally, is that with the VR and gaming, that we have a tool to induce flow and time experiences. And we have a tool with which we can modulate on a subjective behavioral level, and also record then EEG doing brain sciences. And that's the diagnostic part, but also when we're talking about states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, we want to induce different modulations of the sense of self and sense of time. Virtual reality is just ideal. And these things we're working on now, or have been working in the last 2 years, will be transferred to the knowledge in psychiatry, where we will induce these, or try to induce selfless and timeless states in patients with psychiatry, because they have a lot of issues with time and self. But also, just as a side remark, VR can also, I think, be an excellent tool for not only inducing altered states of consciousness, but also, for example, studying interesting aspects of parapsychological concerns like telepathy. If you think about the Ganzfeld approach, where we have a sender where someone is receiving what the sender saw, what we normally had is a sender is looking, let's say, at a photo, or a sender is looking at a video clip. Now we can have a person being totally immersed and present in a VR environment, and having this a very powerful means for senders, even under these parapsychological experimental setups. Okay, that's my take for Federico, who has been studying with us and working for us for 2 years, very successful, a lot of publications. And Federico, it's now to you to talk about the contents.
So, as Mark already anticipated, I am going to talk about the flow experience and the passage of time in video games. In other words, you could say why kids these days are spending so much time with these computers and games. So, a little background that Mark already mentioned, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. He even give you more details that I was going to myself. But this presentation is based, on the one hand, on my prior research as a PhD student. A little correction here, Mark's introduction, I was a PhD student at the University of Cologne and the University of Applied Sciences in Cologne. It was a joint thing. And that's resulted in this thesis that was published by Transcript in 2019, Time and Space in Video Games, a cognitive formalist approach where I combined the formal analysis of the medium of the video game, how video games represent time, structure time, how come we even perceive time while playing video games, and that with theories of time perception from psychology, neuroscience, etc., the cognitive sciences in general, I would say. To explain, on the one hand, why games are like they are, because our mind shapes these objects we create, but also how the video game in turn can affect our time perception. And this was, of course, at this stage of my research, still speculative because this was all theoretical. Then I move on to work at the current project. This is an EU project called VIRTUALTIMES, and I'm here at the IGPP working with Mark Wittmann and my colleague also Shiva Hoshnut in a team. But this is also a consortium with 6 different partners, and Mark also mentioned some of them, like Jülich, for example. It's Kai Vogelei there, and in Strasbourg in France, there's Anne Giersch. They're part of this consortium, together with the University of Helsinki, SAIOS in Barcelona, and the University of Würzburg. We have a website if you're interested in finding out more about this project. It's virtualtimes-h2020.eu. And the objective of this project is to develop a VR technology environment, you could say, or many environments that will help psychiatrists, clinical psychologists diagnose and treat psychopathologies like depression or schizophrenia through the manipulation of time perception. So this project frames the research that we're conducting here at IGPP and the studies I'm going to discuss throughout my presentation. The structure of the presentation is roughly as follows. I'm going to start briefly explaining a little model that explains why time speeds up or slows down in our experience, something we all, I think, experience on a regular basis. Then I'm going to focus more on flow in video games. This is the meat of the presentation, and how flow makes time speed up in our experience. But then I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the opposite. So boredom and frustration in video games, and the slowing down of the passage of time in video games, and what also interesting effects or uses can this have. And then provide a little summary to wrap up. So I really like this episode of Seinfeld. If you've seen the sitcom Seinfeld, this sitcom that ran from the late 80s to the mid 90s. And in this particular episode, the 3 characters, Elaine, George, and Jerry, from left to right, in this photo you're seeing, are waiting to be seated at a Chinese restaurant. And the whole episode is them waiting to be seated. Nothing else happens. They're just waiting and being bored to death. And we as spectators are presumably, at least the goal of the show is to entertain us. It's a sitcom after all. It's supposed to be funny. So at least in theory, we're having fun. And therefore, these 20-something minutes of the episode go fast for us, right? But presumably for these fictional characters, right, the time is going slowly in their experience. We've all had an experience of waiting like this, and whether it's at a doctor's or also at a restaurant or another situation. And I think it's a very common experience that we feel like time really slows down to a crawl and it doesn't seem to pass. And these characters react in different ways. Like Elaine, for example, is very impatient, very much focused on her hunger. But George and Jerry aren't that hungry, but then they start ruminating or thinking about what happened in the day and regretting some things they did and mind wandering. And these are typical effects of boredom in our minds that are also connected to the slowing of the passage of time. Video games, just like sitcoms, and my slide is not appearing properly. I'm sorry. There, it should appear one by one. Ah, there it is. Well, just like sitcoms have this effect. They accelerate the passage of time in our experience. And just for example, think of Pac-Man, right? The classic 80s game in which you control this yellow character in the middle and have to avoid being eaten by the ghosts and eat all of the dots on the screen to go to the next screen and so on. While we're immersed and absorbed by this experience, we lose track of time. Also, a fan favorite nowadays, Fortnite, in which players parachute onto an island and they have to fight with firearms or melee weapons against other players. And it's basically a last man standing sort of thing, or last woman standing sort of thing, where the last player to remain standing wins the game. And it's played by like around 100 players simultaneously. Or to give you another flavor of game, Civilization 6. This is a strategy game where you are from a top-down view, and with a slower pacing, you have to plan ahead to basically help your civilization evolve, whether it's militarily or scientifically or in education or all of those things at the same time. And widen your borders. You can adopt imperialistic strategies or trade with other nations, etc. This game is also designed in a way to capture our attention, to absorb us, and to make us, as a consequence, lose track of time. So there have been studies that have shown that the video games accelerate the passage of time in our experience. A survey by Wood and coworkers, for example, showed that 99% of respondents reported losing track of time while playing video games. These were also very varied types of video games. There was a very large sample. I don't remember the number, but it was very, very clear evidence that video games have this effect. There were also a series of experimental studies by several teams and groups that also showed in the lab that participants underestimated durations of play sessions after playing a video game. There are two caveats to these experimental studies, though. One is that experienced players lose track of time more easily than inexperienced players, possibly because they know how to play and they're more easily absorbed by the games they're playing. Then they don't have to learn it, and it's more fun for them, or more fun for them. And there seems to be an adaptation period of around, some studies said 12 minutes, some 15, some 20, you never know, but before which players usually overestimate times and durations. But with those two things into account, overall, video games accelerate the passage of time and make players underestimate durations. There's a little model that explains this in psychology, why time passes faster in our experience, and it's a pacemaker model called the attentional gate model, proposed by Sakai and Block. This model proposes that there's a pacemaker somewhere in our brains that doesn't need to be a literal pacemaker, but the pacemaker is more like a construct, a theoretical construct that fires pulses. And there's a counter on the other side that tallies these pulses. And the more pulses are accumulated by this counter, the longer the duration appears to be. There are two things that modulate this experience of time, or this pacemaker sort of on this counter. On the one hand, we have to be paying attention to time, and this opens a gate that lets the pulses through to the counter, right? And when we start paying attention to time, then the counter starts accumulating pulses. And then according to the amount of pulses that have been accumulated, we judge the duration to be longer or shorter. But also our emotional arousal can accelerate or make this pacemaker fire faster. So if we're in an emotionally arousing situation, like for example, we're afraid, the pacemaker will fire faster, the counter will accumulate more pulses, and that situation will appear longer to us as well. So this little model fits a lot of the experimental data that has been so far found, and it's a theoretical construct that explains the mechanism of how time can accelerate or decelerate in our experience. But there's then this other phenomenon called flow that has already been mentioned by me and by Mark in the introduction, which was coined, I mean, the term flow was coined by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he was also the first one to study this experience systematically. He started with this in the 1970s, mostly with qualitative studies, and he defined flow. I mean, the definitions of flow may vary, and he updated them through time, but there's mostly a wide consensus on these 9 characteristics of flow that define the experience. And this can be divided into the characteristics that are mostly preconditions for flow or aspects of the task that facilitate flow, and also those characteristics that belong to the mental state of the person, the individual experiencing flow. Corresponding to the task are that the task at hand can be completed, right? That the task has clear goals and that it provides immediate feedback. All these 3 points are true of most, if not all, of video games, right? They usually can be completed, and if you cannot complete the full game, like in Pac-Man, which is designed as a game that it's virtually endless, at least you can complete each subsequent level. So each task at hand is each level that you can complete. And it has clear goals, that is, avoid being eaten by the ghosts, eat all the points in the dots in the map. And it provides immediate feedback. If I press a button or move like the stick, Pac-Man moves automatically. And when Pac-Man touches one of the dots, the dot disappears, meaning that Pac-Man ate it, and so on. And there's also sound. When Pac-Man moves, he produces a particular sound as well, and many other sounds, of course. The aspects corresponding to the mental state of flow can be also divided into 2, roughly, and I would say 4 of them are things that this mental state exhibits. It's deep concentration. We act with a deep but effortless involvement. That means we don't think about what we're doing, we just do it. It's automatic almost. We have a sense of control over actions and over the environment. And the task we perceived as being intrinsically rewarding. This means we don't expect a reward after finishing the task, like money or whatever. We just perform the task because the task is the reward in itself. It's an autotelic activity, as it's called usually. And there are also 2 aspects that this mental state lacks, which is a sense of self. The sense of self tends to disappear. We don't think about ourselves anymore, but we're thinking more of us as part of the environment and the task we're performing. And we lose track of time. We lose the sense of time as well. While in flow, that's why, if you remember the model I presented, we're not paying attention to time, therefore time passes faster in our experience. There is also this little graph that Csikszentmihalyi proposed to explain also a balance that has to be in a flow activity. And I'm going to talk about here exclusively about video games, but this applies to any activity that can induce flow. You can be doing rock climbing and being in flow. You can be dancing and being in flow, etc. There are many, many activities, but in video games, in this particular case, you can talk about a balance between the challenge that the video game provides to the player and the skill level the player has. If you look at the graph here, P1, this is where the player starts when starting the game for the first time. It's a very low skill level, but also the game ideally provides a low level of challenge. So the player is in this so-called flow channel, right? So the player is in the flow because the challenge level matches the skill level. If the player keeps playing and improving their skill levels or their skills, but the game doesn't offer a higher challenge, then the player gets bored. But on the other hand, if the challenge rises too high and the player cannot improve their skills fast enough, then you get into what the theory or Csikszentmihalyi calls anxiety. I would call it frustration in this context of video games. I think it's more appropriate to talk about being frustrated when a video game is too hard than being anxious. So I'll swap that term for the other one. But what happens then, the player needs to keep playing then to improve, and then they get back into the flow channel again. Ideally, the challenge improves proportionally to the skill level of the player, but then it's very hard, to achieve and almost impossible in every case. So usually gameplay is a back and forth from boredom to flow again, to frustration to flow again, and so forth. As long as these boredom and frustration moments don't overstay their welcome, we experience mostly flow, and it's mostly fun to play. But as I'll argue later, I think there are also cases to be made for boredom and frustration in video games, why these could be desirable states. But for now, I'm going to focus on flow as the most desirable state, which is arguably, or at least what most players seek on a game, I would say, and what most game designers seek to elicit also with their games, a flow state. We conducted a study to test also flow states in video games and this correlation between time perception and flow here within the context of the VIRTUALTIMES project. And for this we use the video game THUMPER. I'm going to show you a little bit of THUMPER now. I hope the sound is playing. Yeah, okay. Okay, I want to lower the sound. And as you can see, the player controls this little silver beetle there in the middle of the screen. The beetle moves automatically on these tracks, and things are coming at the player all the time. Lights, curves, right? So you have to react to the incoming stimuli. Like here, in the curve, you have to press a combination of 2 buttons. When a light comes, you have to press 1 button when the light is beneath the beetle, and so on. In that way, you accumulate score. So that was THUMPER. Basically, you have to accumulate a score, and you also have to complete all the levels of THUMPER. And each level, there are 9 levels in total, and you can, each level is subdivided into different sections. We invited 100 participants who played each for 25 minutes. And there were 2 conditions, one in virtual reality or VR, and one on a computer screen, which we labeled 2D. We recorded gameplay video to extract performance data, and we used questionnaires before and after the gameplay session. A little bit more on that in a minute. Participants were Freiburg University students. Well, it was 100, as I already said, 50 male, 50 female, 25 per condition. And we recruited via the regular online portals, flyers, word of mouth, other experiments at IGPP, etc. For those of you, if anyone here doesn't really know exactly what VR, virtual reality is, here's a little illustration. Here's the person wearing a virtual reality headset and holding virtual reality motion controllers on their hands. They can move their hands in this way and press buttons to control the hands of their character. In the case of THUMPER, we don't have hands, but we control the beetle. And this headset has 2 screens, one for each eye, and each screen, as you can see on the image on the right, shows one image of the virtual environment slightly, moved or disjointed so that you can get a stereoscopic image. So you can get depth perception from this image, and I'm fully immersed in the environment. As you can see also, the headset takes up the whole field of view, and you cannot see the room you're in anymore, the real room. You only see the virtual world. And as you move your head, you're looking around in this virtual world. So you're fully immersed inside this world. If you crouch, your character crouches. If you jump, your character jumps, etc. If you walk around, you can also walk around with your feet, basically, your character walks around the environment as well. So we asked basically, is there a connection between flow and time perception? There were surprisingly little quantitative research connecting flow, time perception in video games. And basically one study before us. And if there were, we also asked if there were differences between the experience of time and flow in VR and the 2D conditions. For choosing the game, just a little bit on the rationale behind this and why we chose Thumper. Before choosing it, we had decided that it had to be a game of skill. That is, you could also have picked a narrative game more focused on storytelling, but we thought that maybe flow there is more dependent on the personal taste of the player, if they like the theme of the story or whatever. A game of skill, we thought, is more likely to elicit a flow state, where you have a little concrete task you have to do. And that's also easy to learn and hard to master. That's called Bushnell's law in the game design world, because that's was proposed like this, that a good game had to have these characteristics by Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari. And basically that anyone can pick up a controller and start playing the game, but to master those mechanics and the rules of the game and the game itself had to take time. So it's hard to master. So that gives rookie players, allows them to play, but also very experienced players to go deeper into the mechanics of the game and still have fun with it. We also wanted the game to have unavoidable challenges. That is, that the challenges come to the player and the player kind of just, stand around looking at the sky. Also, we wanted that the players didn't have to look around and find their way in the virtual environment. That can prove disorienting for unexperienced players. We didn't want to recruit just gamers, and we recruited just openly whoever wanted to come. And also the action was focused on one segment of the screen. And Thumper basically checked all these boxes. And a game of skill, because it's a rhythm game. If you, during the video, listen a little bit to the music, it has a very clear beat. And that beat helps you. If you follow that beat and time your button presses with the music, then you play better, because all the stimuli that come are also synchronized with the music. And it's a game that in which to succeed, you have to play well, that is, make a good score, for example, or finish the levels. It's easy to learn how to master because it has very simple controls. You play with 2 buttons and one on each thumb, basically. And it's hard to master because some mechanics go really deep. For example, you can, if you remember the curves in the video, if you press the buttons you have to press while during a curve, right in the second before the curve, you get a higher score. But if you start pressing the buttons earlier, then you get a lower score, but you can still safely take the curve. So that leaves players with not much experience with gaming a little leeway, but they're making a lower score. Also, it has unavoidable challenges because the beetle navigates automatically. Right? So you cannot avoid things. They just come at you and you have to react all the time as a player. And it has a fixed camera. The camera is always behind the beetle, and the action is focused always on the track, always at the center of the screen. So you just look there all the time, and you don't have to do, things that can prove disorienting, like moving the camera around. So when participants came into the IGPP, we briefed them, they signed a consent form, the usual stuff, and then they trained for 7 minutes with the game, or until they finish level 1-6, so level 1, section 6, whatever happened first, basically. And they played Thumper then for 25 minutes in one of the 2 conditions, either in VR or in 2D. And we recorded video of the playthrough, right? As I said, for performance assessment. They also had to answer then the flow short scale. They have to fill that up, that assess their level of flow during the game. We also use the self-assessment mannequin, or SAM, to measure their valence and arousal before and after the game, to be able to compare then the valence, meaning if they felt more positively or more negatively after the game, and arousal if they were more emotionally aroused or not after than before the game. And SAM looks like this. For example, this is the valence scale that goes from a sad face to a neutral face to a happy face, and you pick whichever matches best your current state. And then we use the iGroup presence questionnaire to measure presence in the virtual environment. To assess time perception, we asked 3 questions adapted from a study by Jokic et al. The first one was a question where they had to assess the duration of the play session, and we asked them intuitively without thinking about it. The gaming session lasted X minutes and X seconds. They had to provide this information according to their estimation. We hoped that phrasing the question this way, like intuitively without thinking about it, they would answer more from the gut, from a gut feeling. As I'll show you later, it wasn't necessarily the case. We also asked them, how often did you think about time? And there we used a visual analog scale that went from never to very often. That means they had this horizontal line and they had to draw a vertical line wherever they thought, their experience was, like closer to never than here, closer to very often than over here. Depending on how often they thought about time. Remember, thinking about time, paying attention to time opens the gate that makes the pulses come through in this accelerator and this pacemaker model. And the third question was, how fast did time pass? And we also used a visual analog scale. The options were here: extremely slowly, extremely fast. Worked the same as in the previous question. So briefly, our results were that the more flow participants reported, the less they thought about time, and the faster time passed. This was highly significant, and it was the expected result, basically. So flow correlates with a fast passage of time and less thinking about time, basically, less paying attention to time. The estimated duration did not correlate with reported flow, and we think that, which is a contradictory result, basically, but this has been shown by other studies as well, that when people estimate a duration, they use another process, they engage more cognitive processes and sort of compensate for the feeling of the passage of time being faster, and then give, on average, pretty accurate estimates. I think our participants estimated around 24 minutes duration for a 25-minute gameplay session, which is pretty accurate. So that result did not correlate, but as we expected, time did pass faster in their experience, or felt like it passed faster in their experience while playing Thumper. And all participants, or most, overall participants, reported very high levels of flow as well in both conditions. Also, flow correlated positively with performance, both in score and level achieved. So the more flow, the better participants played, and vice versa. And also they liked the game more, the more they were in flow. There were also some differences between VR and 2D, not pertaining flow in this case, even though there was a slightly higher flow level in the VR participants, this was not significant, so there was no difference in flow between groups. But VR participants in the VR condition reported that the game was easier for them than participants in the 2D condition. They made higher scores, which also makes sense given that the game also felt easier to them. And they had a stronger feeling of presence, which also was expected because they were playing in VR, which really makes you feel immersed, like you are in this virtual environment. And remember, it really shuts you off from the real world because this headset covers your whole field of view. So these were all results. And why are these relevant within the Virtual Times project? Remember, this is a project concerned with developing a tool to treat and diagnose psychopathology. Well, it's particularly relevant, we think, for depression. There was a previous study conducted by Kuhn and co-workers where the participants, they were individuals with depression. They played Boson X, a video game that you can see here on the right on the screenshot, which is very similar to Thumper. They played it for 6 weeks, and this reduced symptoms of depression like rumination, and it enhanced their cognitive ability. Also, as other studies have shown, the patients individuals with major depressive disorder usually report the passage of time drastically slowing down, almost like they're stuck in time, and they have no control of their environment. So it's basically antithetical to flow, right? Flow is, or in other words, flow is antithetical to depression, right? And we think that experiencing flow regularly may help reduce the symptoms of depression, like rumination, because you think less about yourself and about time. And also this feeling of time, being stuck in time, because in a flow state, time passes by really fast. But these claims require all more examination. Now back to, I'm closing in on already to the last part of my presentation, and I want to show you this again, this little table again, because I want to talk about boredom and frustration in video games, just to remind you that whenever you're not in flow because the activity, for example, is too easy for you or too hard for you, you're either frustrated or bored. And I want to argue also that these states can also have interesting uses for clinical psychology, and also can be interesting aesthetic experiences as seen from the perspective maybe of a game designer or a video game player. Boredom happens in games, of course. I've been talking about flow and how video games accelerate the passage of time, but this is an example from a real world case, like in the video game World of Warcraft Classic when it launched in 2019. This is a huge open world game where thousands of players join one server, and they are all in this server like doing quests in this fantasy medieval world, and leveling up their characters and interacting with other players, etc. The servers were so full because there was so much, so many people were expecting this game and eager to play it, that they had to stand in line to be able to finish missions. So for example, you see here a queue of many players waiting to talk to a little, computer controlled character here, because they had to talk to that character to be able to finish a mission and move on. And they have to wait for the previous players to be done with that mission to be able to do it themselves. So this generated waiting lines, which presumably generated boredom and a stretching of the passage of time in the experience of players. So games can also be boring. Also games, when they're poorly designed, they can be boring. We decided to also test boredom in virtual environments. And to explain this, I'm going to provide you first a little bit of background, because Witowska, together with IGPP's director, Stefan Schmidt and Mark Wittmann, conducted a study in which, well, they invited participants into IGPP. They entered this room you see in the photo. Some of you might recognize it if you know the IGPP. And they told them with an excuse, basically, oh, I have to go to another room. I have to go to another room because the previous session with the previous participant took longer than expected, but please wait here, I'll be right back. And the experimenter left the room and then made the participants wait for 7.5 minutes. This whole story was an excuse, so a cover up to make the participants wait for this amount of time. And then the participant came back into the room, and the experimenter came back into the room, and the participants had to answer a series of questionnaires about this waiting time. And what the researchers found, among other things, is that boredom correlated highly with a slower passage of time in their experience and thinking more about time, right? So the more bored they were, the slower time passed in their experience and the more they thought about time. So you look at the picture of the room now, you'll see we created a very similar version of the room in VR for our study, now in the context of the VIRTUALTIMES study. And we basically conducted a very, very similar study and compared the results of that previous study with ours. So in our case, participants came into IGPP, they sat down, put on the virtual reality headset, and were suddenly within this VR room. And we told them, wait here, we will have to go to another room. Again, an excuse, a cover-up story. We have to launch a game from another room, but it will start any second now. I'll be right back. Please, also, we told them please not to stand up and not to move around while waiting. And to make sure they didn't do this, we also recorded video of their VR experience. And we also found, we basically confirmed the results of the previous study. The more bored they were, the slower time passed for them, and the more they thought about time. When going into this experiment, we expected participants to be entertained by VR, and therefore for their experience of time to be a bit faster comparatively compared to the experience of time and the waiting time in the real room. Because we thought, oh, this is a novel, interesting technology. It's really striking how immersive it is once you have a headset on, especially if it's the first time. And participants will be entertained. There will be like a novelty effect. And this will make their waiting time less excruciating, less tedious. That was our speculation. What we found was exactly the opposite. The VR waiting situation was significantly more boring than the real waiting situation. And therefore, their perception of time was also more slower than in the real room, and they thought more about time than in the real waiting room. What we think happened is that they were expecting to be entertained because it's VR, it's an entertainment medium. You expect anything to happen in VR. In a real room, not much can happen. In VR, aliens can come through the window, who knows? And those expectations were not matched. Therefore, they were perhaps more bored by this situation, disappointed, and therefore more bored by this waiting situation. We think also that a situation like this can help, especially with diagnostics of psychopathology, because in many psychopathologies, individuals have a disturbed sense of self, and the sense of self is very closely connected to the passage of time. And if there's an increased attention to the self, there's a slowing down also of the passage of time. All right, so this might help clinical psychologists, psychiatrists to diagnose psychopathologies where this happens, like for example, depression. Incidentally, in another study we conducted with EEG that we're working on the manuscript right now with Shiva Hoshnut and Mark Wittmann, we had participants play Thumper again, but this time we recorded their EEG signals. Shiva was the main person doing this here. She's the expert on EEG. And this time they played only on a screen. And we also measured the flow states, and we found the same correlations: high flow states, high passage of time, at least for absorption in the game. But the interesting thing that I want to highlight here is that we also measure the heart evoked potential, which is a measure for bodily awareness. It's basically how the mind tracks cardiac activity, right? It's a signal that tracks the activity of the heart, in the mind. And this is a measure for, like I said, bodily awareness. And these differences in heart evoked potential can signal differences in bodily awareness during different situations. Our participants had to first wait for 5 minutes, or basically we recorded a resting state of EEG, basically where they did nothing. So they waited, and then they had the gaming session. And comparing these two situations, the gaming session with this waiting situation, we found that there was a loss of bodily awareness during gaming. There was a difference basically in heart evoked potential, which was higher in waiting. But these results haven't been published yet. The final note I want to make, I hope I'm not running out of time too quickly, but this is going to be fast, is about the aesthetics of video games and how these two states of boredom and frustration can also and have also been used, I think, even if it was in an unconscious or more intuitive way as artists used to work in video games. And this game, for example, is called The Graveyard. You're seeing a screenshot here of the game. Usually we associate games with fast-paced action, shooting, and flow states, like I've been saying over and over in this presentation. In the case of this game, you play a very old lady with a cane. You walk very slowly, and you have to walk through this graveyard in a straight line along this path until you reach a church at a very, very slow pace. The image is in black and white. It is a nice, relaxing environment, but nothing much is happening. So players are likely to be bored, or at least to be put in a mental state where they're more prone to mind wandering, to do introspection, to thinking about themselves, to being even impatient. And the goal of the game is basically to reach the end of the path. Then the lady sits down on a bench. Then music starts playing. The game is Flemish, so it's a song in Flemish about death and the end of life. And during the course of this song, the lady dies, and then the game ends. It's not a very happy game, as you can see. And it's not a flow-inducing game. It's basically, if anything, a boredom-inducing game, or maybe if you're not bored, you're at least put in a mental state that I would argue is more appropriate to reflect about the topic of the game, which is death. It's the end of someone's time in this world. It's a very aesthetic experience that can be beautiful as well. But if it were a flow experience, I think we would be not brought as players into a mental state that would make us prone to think about this mental state. In flow games, we usually die and then get back into the game and keep playing. And death is just like I don't know, it's like a little inconvenience. In this case, it's the whole meaning of the game. And I think in this case, eliciting boredom, or at least risking to elicit boredom, or and this lower passage of time is worthwhile. Another case that I want to talk about is Papers, Please. This is a game in which we're an agent working for an officer working for a totalitarian state, and we're at the border, and we ask people for their papers, people that want to get into our country. So as you can see here, the interface is cluttered. It looks boring. It doesn't look very appealing. It's a nice pixel art aesthetic, but you have to look through documents all the time and check that people that want to get into your country have all the appropriate documentation. The thing is, some people might be being dishonest for maybe not too altruistic purposes, and might be smuggling things or being criminals escaping. But other people are really in dire need of help, and might not have the proper documentation. Some people do have the proper documentation, you let them pass. But in those cases where they don't have the proper documentation, you're faced with this decision: do I help them and therefore not do my work properly, or do I not help them? If you don't help them, they might end up in jail, dead, or suffering in some way. If you help them, you risk the government finding out because you're very closely monitored. Then they might cut your pay, even fire you, and that can have consequences as well. They might even, you might not be able to pay your rent or your heating, then your family might die of cold or hunger, etc. So it's a game with basically no happy ending, very frustrating, but it's meant to send also an interesting, to make you reflect about situations of despair, of refugee crisis, for example, totalitarianism, and other difficult subjects. And finally, and to the last point of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about this game. It's called Walden. It's basically a game version of Walden, Henry Thoreau's Walden, because as you may know, Thoreau went into the countryside to have a life more close to nature, even though he was close to a town and he spoke to friends. But he went hunting, he repaired his cabin himself, he mended his clothes himself, and he wanted to have a life closer to nature where he could slow down, be more inspired by it. And this game, not coincidentally, has an inspiration meter in a way. If you work too much in this game, you will, the color, the vibrant color palette of the game will start fading out. It will become more black and white, more monochrome. And the nice violin music in the background and piano music fades out, and the nice nature sounds also fade out, and you start hearing more of a dull heartbeat. This is because your inspiration has depleted. So you have to go out for walks in nature, hear nature sounds, look at things, look at a tree, look at a rock, and then passages of Walden will play and will be read by a voiceover, and your inspiration will return. And this is inspiring you to basically explore this natural landscape and have a more of a mindful experience of something that Eret and co-workers in a study they conducted defined as idleness. Because I've spoken so far of a slow subjective passage of time as something negative, as something associated with negative feelings or a negative valence, and a high, as a fast passage of time, like in flow, with a positive valence, which is commonly the case. But there is a mental state which they call idleness, which is characterized by a high time awareness and a slow subjective passage of time, but positive valence, positive feelings. And this is what they call idleness. And it hinges a little bit upon accepting the constraints of the situation, similar to a mindful attitude. And this leads me to the final point, which is I think the next frontier in VR and in video games, which is mindfulness mindfulness meditation in video games. And here's one example of many of these new games that are coming up for VR, in which encourage you to meditate. And to teach you meditation, mindfulness meditation. In this one, for example, is a biofeedback game in which your breathing is controlled and you have to breathe in a certain controlled way to move forward in this surreal underwater landscape. And you explore it, and in this way, you're induced, a mindfulness state is induced in you. But there are many other games that are exploring these new possibilities. And I think this is now sort of the new frontier of VR gaming that we're getting into. And people seeking more for these experiences where it's flow is still very much cherished and sought after in gaming, and it's an amazing experience, but also this is starting to get more attention, both from designers and from more demand from game players. So to sum up and wrap up this presentation, as we know and experience on a daily basis, time can slow down and speed up in experience. And flow is a mental state that particularly accelerates our experience of time to a very high degree. And video games excel at eliciting flow and thus at making time fly in our experience, right? When playing games, 1 hour can pass by like it feels like a minute. But video games and virtual environments can also have the opposite effect. And both effects, both the acceleration of the passage of time and the slowing down of the passage of time, can find applications in clinical psychology, as I have argued, and also in the design of aesthetic experience with video games that can be entertaining and meaningful. So thank you very much for your attention. These are my contact details and Twitter account, email if you want to contact me.